Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to the NHERI GSC Research Highlight session. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. We're really excited to bring together research from NHERI Graduate Student Council members across different universities and disciplines. This session is meant to highlight the breadth of work being done by graduate researchers in hazards, infrastructure, and community resilience, and also to create space for sharing ideas across the field. Before we begin, I'll briefly walk through how today's session will run so everyone knows what to expect. So each presenter will have 8 minutes to share their work. We'll be keeping time closely to make sure everyone has a chance to present and that we stay on the schedule. I'll give a 1 minute reminder verbally, so we'll move quickly between 1 minute reminder verbally towards the end of each presentation to help with a smooth wrap up. And presentations will run back to back, so we'll move quickly between speakers with minimal downtime. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat. When you do, please include the name of the presenter and presenter for the question you are directing to, so we can organize them easily. Also, we will hold all questions until the end and have a group question and answer session at the end, where we will go through as many questions as time allows. Also, just a quick note that this session is being recorded and will be shared on NHERI GSC platforms, including NHERI ECO YouTube channel and the GSC website. So on this slide, you can see today's presenters along with their affiliation and presentation titles. We do really have a diverse set of topics today, ranging from infrastructure resilience, hazard impacts to social and behavioral dimension of disaster risk. So we're looking forward to hearing from each one of you. With that, let's get started with our first presentation. It's Safoura. So the presenter will be sharing their own screen. I believe Safoura is here. Yes. So Safoura, can you share your screen?
Yeah, oh yeah, okay. So, let me see. Oh, just give me a quick. Okay. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
It's loading.
We can see your poster now.
Okay.
Yes.
So let me make it slideshow. Like this. Okay. Okay. So, sorry. Okay. So today I want to present the part of my research that I presented in the last natural hazard workshop and annual meeting. It is about evaluating the resilience of electric vehicle charging stations during natural disasters with these insights from Hurricane Beryl, which happened in 2024 in Harris County, Texas. So I want to start with a little bit background and motivation. We know that there is a rapid growth of EV sales across the world and especially in the United States. And we know that this can introduce new challenges for the grid operators, network providers, and also for EV users to have access to these charging stations. It's getting like worse because of like increasing the demand for these charging stations. And also we know that this challenge will get more intensified when there is an external shock like hurricane, and for example, people need to evacuate or need to commute for their critical needs, and they don't have access to EV infrastructure because of the inaccessible roads and unavailability of chargers, mostly because of power outage. So it is important to address these challenges. And for the first step, we need to understand the pattern of using these EV charging infrastructures. So in this research, first of all, I wanna understand the changes of using the charging infrastructures during a course of a hurricane. And then I would go deeper and investigate what are the drivers of these changes in using charging infrastructures. So first of all, I start with the data. I use two sets of data, like different sets of data for this research, but I start with the first set of data that I used. This is the EV charging station usage data. This data is a kind of real-time data that like our lab is collecting this data. It shows the in-use capacity of the public charging stations in short intervals, like 10-minute intervals. Then I aggregated this data to make it an hourly panel data of EV charging usage. For this research, for this part of the research in this poster, I collected this data from July 7 to July 14, 2024, to represent the period of the disaster. The hurricane actually happened in July 8th. This is the landfall of the hurricane barrel. And then I collected the similar data, the EV charging usage data, for another period from 1st of April to July 21st in 2024. This period of time is representing the non-disaster and normal situation. So I can compare these two usage together. Also, in addition to the EV usage data, I collected some of the socioeconomic built environment and also station level characteristics that I assume that might be influential to drive these different charging behavior. So after collecting data, I started with conducting k-mean clustering approach to uncover charging patterns. As you can see in the middle of the poster, there are 4 different graphs showing different patterns that I obtained from the k-mean clustering. The vertical red line in those graphs is showing the time of the landfall, and we can see like the changes before and after the landfall of the hurricane. So as you can see, the first cluster is showing the constant usage. It means that there is no differences in the usage before and after the hurricane. The second one is showing that immediately after the hurricane landfall, there is a decline in usage, and it goes for a longer time, like for a long time after the landfall. And in cluster 3, we can see that there is an immediate decline, but shortly after that, the usage goes to the pre-disaster situation. And then in the fourth cluster, we can see that there's a little drop in the usage immediately after the landfall, but shortly after that, the usage increases even more than the pre-disaster situation. With a little bit more analysis, we realized that most of the stations that follow cluster 4 are usually medical centers and hospitals, which makes sense actually, because people usually are more likely to go to these kind of centers after the hurricane. So it makes sense that their usage is increased. So in the next step, we're investigating what are the potential drivers of these differences in a like charging behavior. In the table at the right side of the poster, you can see the result of the multinomial logistic regression model that we used for this analysis. It shows that, for example, for the stations that are located in a wealthier area, like areas with higher median household income, we can see that these stations are more likely to follow cluster 2, the pattern in cluster 2, which means that people living in this area are more likely to have like alternative cars, like gas car, or are more likely to have home charging. So they are less likely to use public charging stations for a longer time after the landfall. And also stations with tree canopies
Safoura, you
around them.
have, sorry for
No
interrupting,
worries.
for 1 minute.
Okay, yeah. And for the stations with tree canopies around them, they are more likely to follow the pattern in cluster 2. About cluster 3, stations that are located in areas with houses with garages, they are less likely to follow a station cluster 3 pattern, which means that these like people in this area are more likely to use their home charging. We considered having garages as a proxy of home charging. And stations with more number of DC fast chargers are more likely to follow cluster 4, which means that people are willing to go to the stations with more DC fast chargers to accelerate the charging process. So as a conclusion, we realized that these charging behavior are more shaped based on like shaped by the power outage pattern and also home charging accessibility. So it is more important in the future development plans to consider adding power outage, power backup generation system, and also adding more DC fast chargers in expanding charging station, especially in close to the critical facilities like medical centers or hospitals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Safoura.
Welcome.
So we'll take the question and answer at the very end. So for our next presenter, it's Samir Nepal. He's a doctoral student from Texas A&M University, and he is presenting his poster on living in the cocoon, perception of preparedness among humanitarian aid workers. Samir, can you share your screen? Okay.
Is it visible for everyone now?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, my this research was out of my master's program when I was at UNT, where I was studying the humanitarian aid workers' perception, how actually they perceive their own preparedness or readiness before being deployed for short-term disasters. It was a poster presentation at Natural Hazard Research and Application Workshop. Uh, So yeah, but before going into detail, there are a couple of terminology that I want everyone to understand because it might not be something that you might have heard before. The first is humanitarian aid workers. It's basically those professionals who work under the framework of United Nations and its partner organizations. Basically, you can understand those organizations who work in the field of health, education, livelihood, protections and those realm, and more focused are more guided by the sphere guideline and the guideline by United Nations. Another terminology I want you to understand that I will be repeating throughout the presentation is temporary duty assignment. It sounds so military for someone, but it's a terminology that is used by the humanitarian community when you are asked by your organization to be deployed within your organization but in a different country. For example, if you're working in Nepal and you are asked by your office, maybe like UNDP or WHO, to go to WHO in Afghanistan just because there was an outbreak and there is a medical need or some sort of short-term need. So that's why we use this word temporary duty assignment. I'll be using this word more often. So if you see the rationale behind this research is because if you go through the lit reviews, most of the research on so far has been understanding more focused on long-term deployments. For example, if you have Ebola or Corolla, or it's like more than like 1 year, 2 years, or there's a military operation, you go in a country to support to go to resolve a conflict or crisis. There are a lot of research on those area for humanitarian aid workers, and also even for there are a couple of research papers on short-term deployments, but they are more focused on military purpose or medical purpose, and very less has been studied about the general humanitarian aid workers or civilian, what we call a civilian humanitarian aid workers. So my focus here is specifically about non-military humanitarian aid workers and also short-term deployment within a country, that's a TDY. So I was looking into two different questions, research question. The first one was, how do humanitarian aid workers perceive their own preparedness during international TDY deployment in disaster area? And the second was there any difference on how they perceive before and after disaster? So I wanted to compare that perception before and after being deployed in disasters. So for this purpose, I did a qualitative research, and I had few criteria for the participants. These participants need to be a humanitarian worker or was a humanitarian aid worker when they were deployed. And the deployment has to be in a disaster area or immediately after disasters, or they were part of relief or recovery or response operations in disasters. And these deployments has to be necessarily within not more than, has to be from 2 weeks to 6 months of duration. If some deployments more than 6 months, it was not considered short-term deployments, and deployment had to be in the last 10 years. And I did a semi-structured interviews for 14 participants. You can see those spots across the globe where my participants were. They were deployment in 12 different countries, and they were part of deployments of various different disasters. So I was looking into those people who were responding earthquake or flooding, El Nino, hurricanes, droughts, cyclones, and epidemic. And you can see 12 different countries where I was conducting the research, and most all of them were done through online Zoom. And it was one of the toughest thing because it's a time zone thing. Uh, People have their own commitments because they are all still working in their own operations, and some of them are still in a disaster or conflict area. So that was hard to get 14 interviews, but eventually we were able to get a minimum of 14. So for this purpose, I use both deductive and inductive coding, and it was very interesting to find few themes and patterns. That's how we do a lot of social research, where we are focused on finding patterns, finding themes and sub themes, and ultimately coming down into like a bigger pictures and what are the more common patterns in the interviews. So when I interviewed these people, what I found that they were very prepared in terms of their personal preparedness. They knew that they need to have vaccines, they need to have their passport updated, they were aware of what kind of clothes to wear, they're updated about their medical conditions. So it seems that they were very prepared about what to carry with them. And they were, since they all knew that this is going to be very short-term deployment, one of the participants said, just pack light, just for 3 months, because it's a 3 months, you don't want to make your luggage very heavy. So they're prepared on making it light and bringing those things that are really needed to them. Another theme that I found very interesting was regarding the orientation that they get or kind of training they get before being deployed, because usually this is very short-term notice deployment, and since it's a disaster, you don't really have much of information. So But despite of the fact when they were provided with the orientations and everything, they said that there was nothing new on the orientation, because most of the orientation that had happened were on checklist approach. They tried to have a standardized checklist, maybe hopefully maybe to adapt to the standard like multi-hazard approach. They try to fit in all the hazards in all together. That's where the limitations of checklist comes in. So they said that there was no comprehensive induction, or they were not given like a complete set of training. So that was another theme that I found. Another interesting thing was about knowing about the country's context. The most important thing, these humanitarian aid workers were prepared in terms of knowing the country's context, and that was to do with the national staff that those were already in the deployment in disasters. They were the main source of information from them, and they got to know about the country, and that they were pre-informed on those things. But regarding the work they were supposed to do on this side, they said that they were not prepared for that. And another interesting part, one of the participants said that I never thought that I will have to stay in a tent. So they thought that they will have at least some sort of
Samir,
facility.
sorry for interrupting. You have 1 minute.
Perfect. And another thing was about the physical and mental breakdowns and burnouts that you expect in disasters. But for certain deployments, they found that it was, when they said that, it was much more worse than they initially thought. And you can see that one of the participants says that they had to work 12 hours and there was no one to stop you. So to conclude, what my research focuses that the deployment preparedness was more focused on personal preparedness, maybe because they expect a lot from organizations, but since they found only standardized checklist and templates, they found that there was a lot of gaps on what they expected versus in the realities, and burnout, stress, and deterioration in physical health was very common during such deployments. So my limitations, I took only 2 to 10, like 2 years, like last 10 years, maybe there was cognitive bias, and it was only focused on international deployment, not within a country. Yeah, and the organization's preparedness and the organizational perception was not taken into account. Economic analysis was not part of the research, and there were. I found that few of the participants were a little bit reluctant to discuss about the policies of organizations when I was having interview. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samir. Okay, so our third presenter is Harman Singh from Pennsylvania State University. She will be presenting on ownership, appraisal, and flood exposure in urban preparedness, extending protection motivation theory in Bengaluru, India. Harman, you can share your screen.
Yes, thank you. Okay, hi, my name is Harman. I'm at Penn State, and today I'm going to be talking more on the behavioral side of flood risk preparedness through the lens of protection motivation theory. And it's okay if you don't know what that is, we will walk through that. So a little bit about Bengaluru. If you're not familiar, that's totally okay. It's a city in South India. I did a massive literature review on inland flooding in India and found that Bengaluru was this unique case where there was a lot of inland flooding, but it was a city that was not built around rivers. And usually when you think of inland flooding, you think of flooding around rivers. So hence I decided to focus on it. The city also has identified severely and moderately vulnerable flood zones, as you can see in this map on the screen. So it also formed the basis of where I could do surveys. And it's not common for cities to identify vulnerable points like this, especially update them all the time as well. Another thing about Bengaluru is it's the third and most recent city to have a climate action plan in India that's also pretty new. The plan came out in 2024 after Mumbai and Chennai, and the plan was influenced by C40 cities, which are now also going hand in hand with the Rockefeller's 100 Resilient Cities program. It's essentially a program where cities share information to be more climate resilient. And Bengaluru was the first South Asian city to become part of it, and that kind of motivates cities to make their own climate action plan. Other issues, Bengaluru has a lot of flooding issues, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, but they also have a lot of water scarcity issues. I focus less on that, but just to say in the same year, they could see both droughts and floods. They are seeing rapid urbanization in since the 70s. You can think of Bengaluru as San Francisco. It's the tech capital of India. There are a lot of disappearing lakes as well. Bengaluru, it was known as the city of lakes. It was the historical way of managing water, and that has existed pre-colonial periods as well. And those have disappeared. Hence, we see more flooding as water is not being managed, as well as lots of waste management issues. This is just one example from the field sites. I've hundreds of photos where drains are completely blocked. So why protection motivation theory? It's been around for a long time, and I was specifically interested in understanding the severity and vulnerability around flooding. A lot of disaster studies have recently started using it, but there have been less studies in the global south. So I wanted to test the theory in a global south setting where essentially you look at the vulnerability and the severity of the disaster, who takes ownership. So that's the augmented part. That's an extension made by Oakley in 2020. And then how do folks cope with that said disaster or risk? So using that, I essentially had my research questions exactly mapped onto it because not a lot of research in Bengaluru has looked at behavior around flood risk. So I wanted to keep it simple. And for our survey data collection, we used that map that I just showed of the severely and moderately vulnerable sites. We picked one site per zone just to get a spread, both like sites that were near lakes, sites that were more informal settings, sites that were more formal settings, or even renters because the city is constantly expanding. And our survey collection team included 6 people. The survey was also bilingual in Kannada and English. Kannada is the regional language. And the survey data collection happened this past August and September. And in the end, we ended up with around 300 households. And mainly, we were just constrained by how much finances we had and the number of people we had on the ground, and ended up doing around 30, 35 interviews per site. For our methods, the survey was pretty mixed. So we had both a lot of qualitative and quantitative data. The quantitative data was mostly binary. We didn't have any numeric variables. So for the qualitative, I ended up doing inductive coding as is shown on the left side of the screen. And for the binary data, we also had a lot of issues with multicollinearity, where a lot of our variables were related. We have a lot of predictor variables. We ended up choosing elastic net regression. I'm happy to explain that later. And our 2 response variables were in line with protection motivation theory, where we were trying to understand why households took flood preparedness action, if any, and whether households were willing to spend money on flood preparedness actions. A few results of our survey. The slides are a little wordy, so I can stop at any point. Most of our respondents had a pretty low income. Very few held salary jobs. Most of them were women, probably because we surveyed during the daytime, and we had a combination of residents and renters, which is really unique in a hazard study because often it's hard to reach renters. So that influenced a lot of our findings. For our results, just given how I showed protection motivation theory, there are 3 aspects. So the first one being threat appraisal. A lot of people had observed flooding, garbage floating on the roads, but it just had become so normalized that a little less were actually worried about it. Around 200 households reported that they flooded several times a year, especially during the monsoon season, which is a pretty big thing in India. And most people, our quantitative modeling showed that indoor flooding and sewage overflow, as well as flood-related health impacts, increased the likelihood of a financial response where people would spend money. And if anyone experienced indoor flooding overall in the study, they were also more likely to take preparedness action. For our survey results, for the coping, there many households, around 1/3 of them said that they did not take any action. So also thinking about how to design a climate action plan where households aren't taking any action and don't have the resources to. Most of them that did take action said that they faced a lot of structural barriers like coping capacity, lack of money, lack of government support that's can't always be assumed, and a lot of time and labor constraints because there were a lot of these people were part of the informal economy. Time constraints also reduce the likelihood of them spending money on any preparedness actions, and renters were also less likely to spend any money. For the ownership, who takes ownership for taking any action at all, households felt that it was mainly the government's responsibility. Oops, skipped a slide. To take action. However, 50% of them did not trust the government. So that was pretty conflicting responses. Many just relied on family or neighbors to ask for help. And around, like, I would say most of our data sets, so 311 out of 316 reported no awareness of any mitigation initiatives, including the climate action plan. And we asked this question in many different ways, and they just couldn't come up with anything. 11 respondents did get some government assistance, very few, and it was usually one-time monetary support. And there was overall belief in collective community action that increased the likelihood of taking any preparedness action. While
I'm
if
sorry
people
for interrupting in the middle. You have 1 minute.
yeah, if people primarily relied on themselves, it kind of reduced the likelihood of action. So overall, protection motivation theory has been tested on pretty stable households where people own their houses and there is like this pretty stable local government. However, in cases where there isn't, I think it's important to add structurally available coping capacity, which is tenure insecurity, financial constraints, especially as we apply these theories in the global south. And assuming that individual capacity is especially not enough when it comes to taking preparedness action. But thank you. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Harman. Well, we have a few questions, but we can bring that together at the end. So the next presenter we have is Pooria from Iowa State University. He will be presenting on fragility functions for weather events to enhance resiliency of transmission lines from experiments to statistics.
Hello, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
All right. So hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Pooria, and today I'm presenting our work that I presented at ETS conference, which was on fragility functions for weather events to enhance the resiliency of transmission lines from experiment to a statistic. So we are looking at a very practical question here. When extreme winds happens, how does the transmission line system fail? Which components fail first? And how we quantify the risk in a probabilistic way. So we focus on a 500 kV transmission line system. It's a large overhead transmission line. And the main goal is to develop the framework that translate the structural response under extreme wind event to fragility curves that can support better resilience and resilience planning and decision making, basically. So the motivation is very clear. So we know that extreme wind events such as derechos and tornadoes, hurricanes are among the major causes of large-scale power outage in the US. We have seen this in recent years in Iowa. At 2020, we had a Midwest derecho, which left millions without power, and also more recent severe wind events that cause transmission tower failures and major service disruption. So the issue is not whether itself, we know it's a threat. And the real challenge is that we still need to better quantify how likely different failure modes are and how those probabilities changes as wind intensity increases. So traditional design approaches do not always capture the full system behavior of transmission infrastructure. So we need to know the interaction between tower conductors and foundation components of these transmission lines under extreme wind events. So the objective is to develop the fragility function and under wind hazard. So we have experimental evidence. I've conducted finite element modeling, and also I did uncertainty quantification of these towers and these transmission lines. So we want to estimate the probability of exceeding several important damage states, including buckling, yielding, collapse, foundation pull-out, sliding of the tower, and conductor failure, basically. So instead of asking whether the system failed or not, we ask a more meaningful question: what type of failure is likely to occur, and what wind intensity does it becomes probable? So a little bit about the workflow. So we begin by defining the key uncertain parameters of the structural components, and then and also the wind loading. And then I apply a Latin hypercube sampling, or LHS, to efficiently generate realization across that uncertainty space. So these samples are then passed into the high-fidelity finite element model which I developed in OpenSeas, where we simulate the structural response of transmission line system under stochastic wind loading. And then, so it's not a deterministic run, so it's probabilistic framework. I did 10,000 simulations. It was a brute force work that I did. And then from model outputs, we evaluate whether the response exceed different performance-based damage states. So for the tower, we consider a progression from buckling, yielding, to collapse. So we also consider a foundation pullout, foundation sliding, and conductor and insulator ruptures on the tower top. So once these damage states outcomes are identified, so across many realization that we did, fragility curves will be developed. So our workflow, as you can see, it's from uncertainty definition, simulation, damage state calibration, classification, then probabilistic fragility modeling. And then, so one thing that is important here that I did in this research is that we develop specific damage states based on performance-based analysis that we had. So we, for example, for buckling, I did a performance level analysis and pushed the towers to get the damage states for the displacement-based damage states of like tower failure. So this matters because utilities do not just need to know that something can fail. They need to know which component is controlling the risk, because that determines whether the best action is the tower retrofit, foundation redesign, or change the conductor system. And the main result on the bottom, you can see the fragility curves show a clear progression in damage probability as wind increases. So starting from buckling on the left, we see that it begins at around 15 meters per second, and its probability increases rapidly and approaches near certainty by 40 meters per second. And then the next is yield. It begins around 25 meters per second and rises sharply by around 45 meters per second. It becomes certainty that you have a failure, and that level will activate it. So for collapse, and the onset of collapse would be around 30 meters per second starting from there, and then it becomes certain at 60 meters per second. And then we also have the foundation failure and conductor failure. They don't fail in the intensity measure of wind speed that I considered, but that's something to consider, that foundation and conductor are not that critical. Another important result here was that, so I was trying to fit different distribution to the statistic data for buckling limited state. Weibull was the best fit, and for yield and collapse, they were like normal and Gumbel were the best
Sorry for
fits.
interrupting. You have
Yeah.
1 minute.
Yeah, sure. And then, so the practical value of this work is how these fragility curves can support decision making. First, they help identify which component failed first, which is critical for prioritizing the retrofit strategy. And then they provide useful insight for design improvements, such as decision related to tower configuration, conductor properties, stuff like that. And then also they support risking for resilience planning, because you have the fragility curves, you can map it to the consequences and get the risks that you are looking at. So that's a framework that combines the experimental understanding, finite element simulation, and getting into the probabilistic modeling. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the next presenter is Jordan from Auburn University, and she'll be presenting on integrating prior knowledge with empirical windstorm performance data, a Bayesian approach.
Can you hear me, see everything okay?
Yes.
All right. Today I'm going to be talking about kind of what we're doing to kind of incorporate two sources of knowledge within our empirical windstorm performance data using more of a Bayesian approach. And so this study really stemmed from the idea that there's a lot of knowledge found in these analytical modeling tools like the NHERI SimCenter's R2D tool, which uses fragility functions for unique building archetypes and predicts the most likely critical damage state. But we also have the Windstorm Performance Dataset, or the WISP, which is an empirical data source developed from multiple post-event reconnaissance missions using the same framework for collecting this data. And so we want to see how we can bridge these two sources of knowledge together in a unified probabilistic framework. And so we took a Bayesian approach solely because it allows us to first start by creating an initial belief about parameters, essentially encoding what's known through a prior distribution. And then it uses a likelihood function to explain how well different parameters explain the data. And finally, it returns the posterior distribution, which is updating model belief of parameters after seeing additional data. And so to first incorporate that prior knowledge, we created the synthetic data set, which is based on those fragility functions from the R2D tool, which are associated with those unique building archetypes. We expanded that suite of archetypes to include two additional parameters, one for storm type and one for roof covers, since we also have that within our empirical data. And we used adjustment factors to those fragility functions to then predict a damage state from our simulated testbed. And so we created a Bayesian ordinal logistic regression model, and we started with two baseline models, one being the empirical data model, or the EDM, and the other being the synthetic data model, or the SDM. And what this allowed us to do was understand where the baseline of these two sources of knowledge came together, or currently existed. And so when we look at these posterior distributions, they're telling us the effect of these parameters on increasing levels of damage. So if we look at something like wind speed first, it shows us that both models agree that as wind speed increases, the probability of damage increases as well. But we see, for the most part, throughout all of these attributes, that both data sources are agreeing on the effect. However, there's a slight disagreement through the magnitude of the effect of these attributes. And so we looked at two different approaches for combining these two sources of knowledge together, one being the higher M, or the hierarchical modeling approach, where we pulled these two sources of data together and grouped them by data source. And then the sequel-LM, which is a sequential learning model, where empirical data is updating synthetic prior distributions. And so for the most part, what we see is that those two approaches are kind of meeting in the middle between those two data sources, which is what we would expect. But more importantly, it's showing us that parameter influence is shifting based on not only the data source, but also the model structure, where the sequel-LM leans more towards those tight prior distributions from that synthetic data, which is a very controlled data set. And so when we look at kind of performance of these models, we have additional model metrics that we're looking at, but looking solely at the predictive accuracy, the sequel-LM actually achieves the highest accuracy, but all of them together achieved approximately the same. I think it ranged from 35 to 31% across all of our models when tested with an empirical test set. However, we also see that in figure C and D, that's our sequel-LM and our EDM, that neither one of them was able to predict a damage state 3. But in the higher M model, in figure F, we're able to see that it starts to understand some of that damage state 3 classification, but still performed lower than that sequel-LM. And it really brought us back to this ordinal damage state that's commonly used within windstorm performance data, where it's this different combination of component failure levels. And so instead of continuing with that, we decided to adjust our framework and look at kind of a different assumption, which is that there is an independent failure mechanism that occurs, aka the weakest link of the chain, that's influencing performance. And so we first started by isolating our analysis to a single event. Let's remove the construction variability, the different uncertainty associated with hazard intensities and things like that, and focus it on the Hurricane Harvey testbed. And we expanded that with additional attributes for the aerodynamic parameters using OpenTopo LiDAR point clouds. We then redefine those damage states. So instead of looking at different combinations of component failures, we isolated different failure mechanisms. So we have no damage, envelope damage, substrate damage, and structural damage. And then we also adjusted our modeling framework. So instead of one ordinal model, we created 4 independent binary logistic regression models, which are predicting the probability of being in each respective damage state. And finally, those posterior distributions now reveal each variable's influence on each type of failure that we're looking at. And so these are the results of our Hurricane Harvey testbed. We achieved a model accuracy of 62.9%, which is substantially higher than what we saw previously in our ordinal model. But what these distributions show us now is how each attribute affects higher and higher levels of damage in its own independent framework. And so what we see here is that as wind speed increases, we are more and more likely to see higher and higher levels of damage, up to structural damage. But also, as wind speed increases, we are less likely to see no damage, which makes sense based on what we understand from engineering. Similarly, in terrain, as terrain roughness increases, we're more likely to see no damage or just envelope damage, but the inverse becomes true as well, where as terrain roughness decreases, we're more likely to see substrate or structural damage. And so what this shows us is kind of the influence of different attributes on specific types of failure. We also tested this within our WISP framework or our WISP testbed using the same attributes that we had in the ordinal model previously, and we were able to achieve an accuracy of 51.5%. So again, much higher than what we saw previously, but again, just confirming different relationships that we know from engineering, but also understanding things like roof cover shingle, where that the distribution for substrate and structural damage is spanning 0, meaning there's no statistical significance for that attribute on substrate or structural damage. And so in conclusion, this framework is allowing us to start to bridge the gap between our physics-based engineering and statistical learning, allowing us to move toward more explainable risk-based modeling. And we're currently actually working on improving our wind speed estimates using more advanced wind field models that are accounting for terrain, wind directionality, and time dependence, as well as looking at testing a different assumption using a Bayesian continuation ratio framework, where we're able to model that cascading, more top-down failure of progressive collapse. And that's all I got for you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jordan. Okay, so the next presenter is Richard from Oregon State University. He'll be presenting on urban fire and high wind impact on electrical distribution network performance and restoration in the Southern Great Plains. Okay.
How is that? Is it visible?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. A little background. This was a plenary session presentation at the Computational Symposium at UCLA. And I believe they told us we had like 4 minutes to give this presentation to an entire group of people. But now I have 8 minutes, so I get to keep you all here for a little longer. And I am looking at multi-hazard. We're looking at wind and fire on electrical distribution systems. So different from what Pooria was doing. He was looking at transmission. Okay. And again, because of the nature of that short presentation format, everything here is kind of crammed in to get as much out there as possible. But I'll explain most of this for you. The problem was that in Oklahoma and a lot of these southern states, Texas even, we saw it in California, Hawaii, there were a lot of these electrical distribution failures from high intensity wind. So these strong winds would break apart these wooden poles, and then the electrical system would cause an arc that arc would then cause fuel to ignite, and then we'd have these intense wildfire urban fires that would spread across and cause more damage. Now, these are very intense fires because of the intense wind. So not only is it a driver for electrical pole failure, but once that fire starts, it's a huge contributor, the wind is, to spreading that fire and causing more damage. So we're looking at that. That's the problem we want to solve is how can we make these systems more resilient, and how can we start to approach that system? It's been done a little bit more for transmission systems, but again, this is distribution. This is local. This is the things you see outside, the wires, the cables that you see outside. So if you lose power during a windstorm, it's likely something going on here. So what you see here on the right is the electrical network. Now, I'm not showing a lot of details here only because it's a security issue, so we don't disclose where this is at or how big it is really, or sorry, the location of it. But what you're seeing here is at the very top would be a substation, and that's where the transmission line connects, right? So you'll have a transmission line, a high voltage going into a substation, and then it branches downwards. So at the very top, that's where that initial power would be, and it gets distributed, right? It's a distribution system down to consumers. So all these dots would be homes, stores, and different structures that require power, right? So we have to have this idea of criticality. What is the most important node in this system? And well, because it is a branch, the closer you are to the substation, the more important your node is, right? Because if you cut it off at the very beginning, then everyone down the line loses power. So we developed this criticality system based off of distance from the substation, as well as how much power is being consumed. And that's why you see this variation in color. So this criticality index goes from 0 to 1, meaning the number 1 is the most critical. Now you can tailor this to however you want. We just did this in a very simple way just to run these calculations. But here's the idea. As Pooria was saying, we have to have these fragility curves to assess the risk of failure, right? Or the probability of failure. On the left here, we have two failures probabilities. And at the top, we have a flame length. And on the bottom, we have it by wind speed. So there are two different components that we're interested in. The main cause is the pole failing due to wind. That's at the bottom. So you can see we have fragility curves for various types of distribution poles, so various classes of these poles. And we can see how much wind, if we subject it to some so-and-so wind, what is the probability of it failing due to that wind? We also have it based on age as well. So how aged is that infrastructure? And we can see that failure probability. At the top is the conductors. So the conductors don't necessarily fail all too often from wind, but they do fail due to heat intensity. So as the fire starts to radiate this heat, these conductors, these lines, will start to degrade or fail or run over the limits that they're supposed to be running. So these lines are pretty hot already. Adding more heat causes them to fail. So once you have all of these failures due to the wind, again, the scenario is that you have these fire weather conditions, these intense wind speeds, these dry humidity, all of this contributes to fire spread. So you'll have a pole fail, and on the right here, you see a fire simulation. All these black areas are where fires started due to infrastructure failure. Now, this is one of the most intense scenarios we ran. This isn't the usual. Usually you have maybe 2 or 3 fires going, but this is also 40 miles per hour. So that's very intense wind speeds. A bit unrealistic, but again, this is the most intense just for visual purposes. So we'll have these fires that start to spread, and then the resulting fire spread, we can then use the fire fragility curves to determine conductor failures as well. If we overlay our system, we can start to see how this is working out. So in blue, we have active poles. In purple, we have the affected poles due to fires. And the red lines here are the affected conductors or the wires, the connecting lines between poles that have been
Richard,
affected to fires.
sorry for interrupting. You have 1 minute.
Yeah, thanks. And the yellow areas are the ignitions. Again, we use conductors, probability failures, and then we get that estimate. What we use this information for is to determine the performance. So this whole idea is to get the performance, the resilience performance of your network. And then you can later expand that to risk analysis as well. But we can see here, as we begin to restore, we send repair crews out to restore these poles, and we can get an idea of how long it's going to take to restore this network back to its function, right? So where at the beginning, you see at time 0, we have well, no impact, and then we get suddenly an impact and start to restore this network back to its function. And that's the whole goal, is to see what is vulnerable in this network and how can we repair it. Yeah, thank you. And I have some future work that's related to NHERI because that was required, but that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Okay, so the next presenter is Matthew from University of Delaware. He'll be presenting on social isolation and loneliness, comparative perspective.
Okay, so is that in showing a poster, right?
Mhm.
Okay, great. So Richard's talking about how his is different from Jordan's. Yeah, mine's even more different from Jordan's and from Richard's. So this topic's a bit different from the other ones. But does it relate to disasters, as you'll see here. As populations in many countries experience demographic shifts towards aging, it's important to recognize the implications for this on disaster planning, such as a lot of old folks now over the age of 65 living alone. So you might have heard of the Longitudinal Health and Retirement Survey from the United States from starting in 1992. It's currently housed at the University of Michigan. So there's also counterparts for these across other countries. The first of these being ELSA for England, there's CLOSA for South Korea, and there's a whole bunch of those. So I looked at about a dozen of those because better understanding how these instruments used can vary can help also understand how certain social issues with disaster planning have consequences for older adults and how they're viewed across different countries. So you might ask, well, what are social isolation and loneliness? Because I'm an engineer and I've been doing fire simulations, all this stuff. No, not me, but other folks, right? So what are they? They're often overlapped, but not exactly the same either. So social isolation can be defined as limited to no contact with other individuals. And loneliness can be defined as a subjective feeling that emotional needs are not being met by social contact. So which makes these different because, for instance, you can be at a party of a bunch of folks who you have nothing in common with. Are you socially isolated? No. But are you lonely? Yes. On the other hand, let's say you're a monk who wants to be in a retreat on the top of a mountain with no contact with anybody by choice. Are you lonely? No. But are you socially isolated? Yes. And of course, these two can go hand in hand. So as I said, there are societal implications for disaster planning as there may be older adults experiencing either or both may have substantial difficulty evacuating prior to enduring or recovering from a disaster. So there's a social emotional selectivity theory, which states that, which argues that as older adults gain age, they'll prune their connections towards the ones which give them their lives more meaning. But this, if true, this also could be disrupted by disasters because their networks can mean that they'll have suffered lasting or permanent negative consequences due to difficulty in re-engaging with others or replacing pre-existing consequences or connections. So the purpose of this research is to better guide future decisions for disaster management when considering the issues of loneliness and social isolation. Therefore, I have 3 research questions. The first couple of these are pretty basic, right? Do these surveys have any questions about pertaining to social isolation and loneliness in response? Of course, the answer was no, then there would be no point in the rest of the study, right? And there wouldn't be any poster to present. So you can safely consider the answer to that is yes. The second question is, how many of these longitudinal surveys pertain have questions returning to loneliness and social isolation. Again, the answer is no, then there wouldn't really be much of a poster, right? Now, the third one, though, is how are these relevant questions pertaining to loneliness and social isolation grouped categorically? So there's something called the Gateway to Global Aging. You can look it up. It's funded by the National Institutes of Health, National Institute of Aging. It has a whole bunch of these surveys and their instruments, as well as some of the results with an asterisk. You can't necessarily access all of them. So my hypothesis is that the United States would have a lot of questions pertaining to loneliness and social isolation because it's the oldest survey. And due to the way these surveys work, it's easy to just add on questions afterwards. A lot of them can be the take-home portion. So after that, I hypothesized that the U.S., and in no particular order, U.S., the United Kingdom, Japan, and South Korea would have the most questions. Why? Because in particular, those three countries, UK has had a high-profile campaign regarding loneliness and social isolation. They had a minister for loneliness about 2016. They don't have it anymore in the current government, but they did in the past. Japan and South Korea are countries with heavily aging populations and also have high-profile campaigns. A lot of the literature I've looked at has to do with is from Japan's academic literature. And South Korea, they've had their Soul Without Loneliness campaign launched in December 2024. So I looked at about 12 countries. Well, I want to say that Chile, I couldn't even look at their instrument. And also there was a survey for SHARE, which is large parts of Europe here in blue, but I just there for completion. And so I reported those results here. I guess I can try to zoom in. Well, maybe I shouldn't, just to not disrupt this thing. But so China and Brazil, I found no relevant questions. I used the most recent available version of the survey that was available on the Gateway to Global Aging. So the big surprise was, you see the green here, the one with the most, or the orange here with the most questions. Number one was actually the Republic of Ireland, which apparently had a lot of questions which were not expected at all. The United States here in green was second, and in England was third. But you can see here for red is South Korea and purple being Japan. For CLOSA and JSTAR, they had very few questions relative to what I was expecting. So it's not a surprise that the United States was second highest because, well, it's been the oldest questionnaire. Remember, the majority of these questions have to do with retirement and health because hence the name. However, Japan and South Korea had very few, which makes me think that based on the literature, there might have to do with the longstanding stigma with reporting mental health, especially for older adults. And especially given the way some of these surveys are administered, oftentimes there's a take-home version of those. You could easily see with the multi-generational households that if the questions were to have to do with, say, relationships with your adult children or grandchildren, those people might be the ones helping you fill out this questionnaire. So that might have to do with delivery of some of these surveys. Another big surprise here, if you look at Mars, which is the gray one here from Malaysia. Now, you take away one question on physical activities and the broader catch-all category of psychosocial, you see these other three categories, how it's divided up. It's family support and adult children, family support and adult parents. So remember, these questions are for older adults about the age of 65 and up. So they're talking about their parents who might be in their 90s or 80s. And the last one, family support and siblings. What does this mean about Malaysia? It could mean that in the framework of Malaysia, how they're considering aging and also disaster preparedness for older adults. Of course, Malaysia is a country with a very large population, but it may mean that older adults who exist outside of a traditional family support structure with children and perhaps siblings and their own parents still alive, if they don't exist in that sort of family, then they're just not accounted for, perhaps from the academic structure, and perhaps from the governmental structure they may not also be accounted for. And an interesting thing too is that I was completely surprised to see Ireland. I also want to report that Northern Ireland has its own the Nicola here in yellow, which is separate, but the Republic of Ireland, this is here in orange, was a complete surprise to me. I did not expect a lot of these questions to have sections in social connectedness, which is its own 30-question section. It looks like I have, 1 minute left. This is a complete surprise to me. And it's also interesting, too, because Ireland is not rapidly aging compared to other countries in Europe. However, they do have relatively high levels of self-reported loneliness and social isolation. So what this may mean to conclude is that Ireland, there may be a disconnect between their academic reporting of these studies compared with their governmental policies. So what this means, Well, to be determined. And if you're curious, none of this is on my dissertation. I mean, a lot of themes are the same, but this is just a side project for last year's hazards workshop. So yeah, that's about it. Feel free to add questions in the chat.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Okay, so our next presenter is Najiba from Oregon State University. She is presenting on impacts of post-disaster debris management on community, a case study on Hurricane Helene and Milton 2024. You're on mute, Najiba.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, cool. My name is Najiba, and thank you for introduction, Rajee. And my research focused on impact of post-disaster debris management on communities, a case study of Hurricane Helene and Milton. So, come on, move. Sorry, stop moving. Let me see. Oh, okay, it's moving. Good. So, if you don't know what debris looks like, this is how it looks like. This is the picture from left side, Florida, Hurricane Helene and Milton, and this is Louisiana after tornado March 2023. And just to give a little background, there are 4 types of debris: household debris, construction, demolition, vegetation, and hazardous debris. When a hurricane or any kind of disaster happens, it generates 5 to 15 times more debris than any community generates in a whole year, which is, you can see the volume of the debris that's taking place. And 25% of total disaster recovery cost goes for debris management. And it has a huge health impact, such as asbestos coming from the building material causes asbestosis and cancer, and a lot of health impact, I think. Samir can relate more. And for disaster debris management cycle, this is guideline by FEMA, how it goes. And I'll just focus on debris collection area. And I would urge you to look at the picture here on the right side, FEMA debris management guidelines. So if you are impacted by hurricane or tsunami or anything, any disaster, then you are asked to put your debris like this and separated by the way they asked. And how these things happen, generally, you put it out, then a truck comes, take it to temporary debris management cycle and reduction and recycling sometimes, and final disposal, and then it goes the cycle again. And if you have your own vehicle, then you can definitely take it to the collection center. So therefore, I was looking into literatures and I found like time, cost, environment, and health is at the frequent theme camp. And that's why my question was, what did local government officials and private contractors working in disaster generated debris management perceived barriers and significant this whole thing, and how did the barriers and supports differs within local government as well as contractor who work on this field. Here, private contractors, I would say private contractors such as they are hired to manage debris. So this is the map. You see Hurricane Helene and Milton. This color like pink, like purplish one, or peach pink. Yeah, peach kind of like hard they hit more. And if you see the dots, they are basically like people who has debris on their property, and thanks to crisis cleanup. If you don't know about crisis cleanup and attended natural hazard workshop last year, you know you got a big book kind of from crisis cleanup. So they shared their data with me, and I conducted survey, like interviews, I would say, interviews in this region to talk to local stakeholders such as who work in this local municipality, then try to reach state and FEMA officials. Therefore, I conducted 32 semi-structure interview. I found like communication coordination is another issue which has not been mentioned in other literatures which I have been reading. And to be honest, most of the literatures in disaster debris management, from engineering perception, there is no community or social science perception. Even I will talking to these stakeholders, they told me like no one asked us like how we are managing everything. Even I tried to reach out to get community perception to do their like interview, but it was hard to get them. So hopefully I'm launching a survey that will help them. And Therefore, after like interview, I just transcribe, recorded, and the thematic coding who are more into social science can definitely understand. And that's why I divided like what are the barriers and support for them. So these are the kind of themes that emerged. I won't go into details definitely, but I will just go ahead and mention some of the barriers so you guys know that how it's there's a huge barrier for both side contractor and government official. So some of the course, I would say sometimes they would say they are in like multiple events and people are fighting over resources. They had a lack of resources. And for government official perception, they would say generally I had 10 to 15 crews. This year I had 4. So that was a huge challenge for city officials to manage debris. And there's a huge burnout. There are people who would have those who are working as a volunteer, they don't have enough health support or how to like manage those debris. They don't know. They're basically just coming in and making those assumption. And another challenge I would quote here, like one of the government officials said, like a major challenge we faced was ensuring effective communication with our entire population, particularly our large Hispanic community. So how to manage those debris? As I said, you look at the picture right side. So it was a huge challenge for people who don't speak English, how to manage their debris. And some of the assistants or FEMA officials who like the guideline by FEMA directed local government officials to remove debris who has their single home. So if you're living at apartment or like rented home, those are like looks like apartment, then you are supposed to manage your own debris. And price was huge issue. Like this time contractor went from $9 per cubic yard to $48 per cubic yard to remove those debris. And of course, the amount of debris is tons and millions. So that's a huge financial strains on small cities compared to the bigger cities. And there is definitely limited green space. So they had to use baseball field as a debris management site, which wasn't ideal. And it's not all bad, definitely. There is definitely some supports was like establishing pre-vet contracts. Like if they have pre-vet contracts with some of the like contractors, that definitely helped them forming interagency task forces. Like if they had pre-vet meetings and task forces, that definitely helped them to manage debris. Some of them city did pretty good. And defining clear operational boundaries. These are some supports that help them, and definitely having a GIS tracking technology, then standardized FEMA guidelines. Some of the guidelines change frequently, which kind of, if there was like there was like a pretty standard guideline that would have been helpful. And conducting preparedness drills, they wanted like people has more, which city conducted more drills, they had more prepared for managing disaster debris. And for the future work, I would say I'm still launching a survey protocol from this qualitative study and definitely dispersing my survey here. And as my funding is from Cascadia COPSUB, so I am also conducting a survey with the people who are staying, who will be managing tsunami debris. So definitely that's a challenge because still Oregon has a debris management plan, but Washington and Northern California, which is under Cascadia subduction zone. If you don't know Cascadia subduction zone or what is Cascadia COPSUB, definitely reach out to me. I'd be happy to explain and tell you more about it. And yeah, the ultimate goal is to find temporary debris management site, which will have both perception from both communities and stakeholder. Yeah, that's all. And thank you. Any questions and comment? And thanks to NSF and Cascadia COPSA for their generous funding and support. And also thanks to all the participants who attended helped after Hurricane Helene and Milton. They talked with me and gave their time, definitely. And let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you so much. The last presenter is me. So I will be presenting on, okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, okay. This was my master's work. I'm currently a PhD student at Stony Brook, but this was my master's work at Southern Illinois University. So, okay. So I'll be presenting on quantifying the cost and benefit of managed retreat insights from two Illinois communities, Valmeyer and Greater Olive Branch. As we all know, flooding remains one of the most frequent and costly hazard in the United States, and especially in levee-protected areas, the risk that is affected is usually misunderstood due to what we call the levee effect, which is a false sense of security that levee provides to the people, which actually increases long-term exposure by increasing development beyond the levee protected areas. However, as climate risk intensifies, uh, structural measures such as levee, dam, they may not be enough or able to withstand rare and extreme events. Hence, managed retreat, which is also known as the purposeful, planned, and voluntary movement of people, structure, and infrastructure away from high-risk areas to mitigate climate change impact, is increasingly discussed as a long-term solution, which includes both the structural as well as non-structural measures, but more towards the household level. But regardless of that, there is still a major gap. We still do not fully understand when retreat is actually cost effective and when it works socially. So this research is the gap that this study addresses. Most existing research focuses either on engineering or on social outcomes, but doesn't integrate both of it. So for this research, my question was, is managed retreat actually cost effective, and how do social and institutional conditions shape its success in a community which was supposed to be protected by structural measures? To answer this, maybe I should zoom in a little. To answer this, I compared two very different communities, Valmeyer and Greater Olive Branch. Valmeyer is a centralized town that fully relocated after the 1993 Mississippi River to a nearby bluff in a higher elevation land. The community collectively relocated almost 250 households to a higher elevation, whereas for the Greater Olive Branch area, it's a dispersed, unincorporated area that relied on voluntary buyouts after 2011 flood. They tried to operate relocation, but could only limit themselves to buyouts. These cases, specifically choosing these cases, allow us to isolate the physical risk as well as the governance and social capacity that each community had. To evaluate this, I combined three components. First, the hydrodynamic and flood loss modeling to estimate the expected annual damages, or EAD. This also includes levee breach scenarios and probabilistic model for expected flood losses from levee breach. Second, I use those EADs to calculate the benefit cost ratios, where a value of 1 normally indicates that a strategy is economically justified. According to FEMA, the discount rate that is currently being used is 7% under the current administration, whereas the previous administration before 2024, they used 3.1% of the discount rate. When we think about discount rate, it is basically the current dollar value will be worth more in the future. So we should be discounting it to do a proper cost benefit analysis. For the third part, I conducted a longitudinal socioeconomic descriptive analysis, looking at changes in population, income, housing, and demographic over time in both the communities. I also analyzed actual scenarios like Valmeyer's full relocation and Greater Olive Branch's buyouts, but I also included counterfactual scenarios like what would happen if Olive Branch had relocated instead of just completed the buyout. So this allowed me to compare both what actually happened in 1993 and 2011 and what could have happened. First, in Valmeyer, from the figures, we can see that relocation was clearly cost effective. The benefit cost ratio exceeded 1, especially under high damage flood scenarios. I had 3 different scenarios, best case, worst case, and the 1993 flood scenario. Given that the 1993 flood was such a big event, there were multiple different places where levee breached. So we had the best case scenario, worst case, and the 1993 breach scenario, among which it was cost effective in the 3.1% discount rate, but not in the 7% discount rate for the best and for all the 3 scenarios. Whereas in contrast, for the Greater Olive Branch, the story is very different. Full relocation scenarios, all the full relocation scenarios have a benefit cost ratio of below 1, meaning they were not economically viable, which makes sense that it actually did not happen in real scenario as well. However, targeted buyouts did exceed a BCR of 1 under certain scenarios, whereas in certain it did not. So already from this, we see something like important, that retreat is not universally optimal, and the type of retreat that we are doing matters. Now, here is the part that is often missed in benefit cost analysis or assessment related researches. Even when economic metrics suggest a strategy is viable, social and institutional factors determine whether it actually succeeds. So in Valmeyer, we can see from this scale diagram, population rebounded, income increased, housing quality improved, and community institutions were retained after the relocation. Whereas in Greater Olive Branch, population declined, housing deteriorated, economic conditions stagnated and or even worsened, and recovery was very slow and fragmented. So even within these scenarios, the baseline condition before they even thought about or started discussing about any kind of mitigation strategy, the condition of the community were vastly different. So the key takeaway from this is that the success of retreat does not only include about like reducing risk. It depends on the background governance structure, social cohesion, communities unity, level of government that starts the discussion, and also the institutional capacity. Valmeyer had centralized leadership and could coordinate relocation, whereas Greater Olive Branch had fragmented governance, given that it was an unincorporated community. And they had limited capacity, both locally as well as in terms of staff to conduct the process, which constrained their outcome. So overall, if we think about what does this mean more broadly, we can say that managed retreat is often treated as a technical or economic decision, but this study shows that economic efficiency alone is not sufficient. Social and institutional conditions fundamentally shape the outcomes, including both the baseline and how the community changed, how the community dynamic changed. So to conclude, managed retreat is not a one-size-fits-all strategy. It is highly context-dependent, and relocation might work best in high-risk areas, especially in communities with strong governance and cohesion, while in a more vulnerable, dispersed communities where there is not much unity and not much support from the local government, targeted buyouts may be a more realistic and effective approach. That's about it for my presentation. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, just let me know. Okay. Alrighty. Thank you, everyone. So I think the questions that were asked have already been answered in the chat itself. I'm just going through the chats. Yes, I think most of the questions that were asked here has been answered. Okay, Robin has a message. Okay. So if anyone has any questions, you can like turn on the mic and ask questions or just put it in the chat.
Good job, everyone.
We don't really.
I have a question for Samir. If he's here.
Sorry, yes, Najiba.
Yeah.
Samir.
So yeah, you talked about you reach out to volunteers and health workers who worked on disasters. So have you asked, or like you're planning to do a survey with them, or you asked about how they managed after her, like any kind of disaster, or how they coordinated each other, or even city officials, like how they connect with each other with volunteers and everything?
It was for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but like my research was not focused on health workers, but it was on different aid workers or disaster responders working in like diverse
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
disaster. But yeah, since they were going to an international deployment where a lot of context was very new to them, I saw that there was a very coordinated effort. And just let you know that this deployment was within the same organization. So even if you are in Pakistan and you are going to go in maybe in Iraq for a deployment, it has to be within the same organization. It's not like you are going to a new organization. So there was a coordinated effort, but they lied just because they might not have exposed to that certain type of disasters. For example, one of the participants had never been to earthquake response. He was from South Korea. I don't know if South Korea had a lot of earthquake or not, but he said that he had never experienced that. He had only experience of going to flood response, and he never thought that there would be an aftershock. For us, it might be, oh, everyone knows that, but for someone who have never experienced that disaster, it's very unique for them. So I saw that kind of um, like difference in like the exposure that they have or the experience they had was not matching to what sort of deployment they were being asked to go. So but having said that, when you asked about coordination, yes, there seem to be a lot of coordinations and support by a local or the host country when they were asked to be deployed in disasters. That's where they need that. If you see, my one of the theme was understanding the context or the culture was very prominently explained by most of the participants.
Thank you.
Okay, we're right about time. Do we have any more questions? Alrighty. Thank you so much for your time. It was great having everyone share their research. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Rajee.
Thank you.
Hey, Jordan.
Thank you all.